Become a premium member on RealCatholicTv.com today. Not only will you learn about the one true faith, just think of all the new friends you'll make.
Hello everyone and welcome to The Vortex, where lies and falsehoods are trapped and exposed. I'm Michael Voris, coming to you from Sydney, Australia. Here in Australia, the church is going through the same travails as the church in other parts of the world, of the Western world. Slumping mass attendance, rejection of one church teaching after another, shrinking numbers of native-born Catholics. Like the United States, if it weren't for immigration numbers artificially propping up the overall numbers, the church would be fading into non-existence. But here in Australia, there is a hidden success story that goes largely unnoticed because the overall picture is so bleak. First, a little background. The Catholic Church is comprised of a number of different rites all over the world. By far, the largest one that nearly every Catholic is familiar with is the Latin Rite. This is the rite to which nearly every Catholic in the Western world belongs. Nearly every Catholic. But there are nearly 24 other rites in the Church, all perfectly in communion with Rome and the Holy Father, and every bit as Catholic as Latin Rite Catholics. And here in Australia, the hidden success story within the Church at large is the Maronite Catholic Church, one of those almost 24 Eastern Rite Catholic churches. It's booming, growing, and intensely faithful, certainly by any comparison to the Latin Rite Church here down under. The Latin Rite Church has been undergoing a continual slide in mass attendance for decades, now standing at less than 14%. Less than 14% actually attend Mass. The strange phenomenon with the Latin Rite, here as in other places in the West, is that while its overall raw numbers may be increasing, the actual number of faithful Catholics within that overall number is actually decreasing, as measured by mass attendance. Here are the supporting numbers. Since 10 years ago, the overall population grew by about 2%, the Catholic population here in Australia. But even as the number of Catholics increased, less and less of them as a proportion went to Mass, dropping to near 13% from above 15% over the same time period. This means that as more and more people come to the church, less and less attend Mass. And that suggests that an entirely different type of Catholicism, or at least an understanding of it, is what's purporting to be Catholic, is what's emerging. But when you look at the Maronite Rite, it's an entirely different story. Their overall numbers here in Australia are increasing, and so are the numbers of those attending Mass. Exactly what you would imagine should be the case. But there's an even more telling piece of data. Not only are more Maronite Catholics attending Mass, but the rate of attending Mass is also increasing. 10 years ago, 30% went to Mass. Now that compares to the 15% from the Latin Rite. Today, it's almost 50%, from 30 to 50%. In short, as the Maronite Catholic population continues to increase here in raw numbers in Australia, a greater share of them are also going to Mass now. The bottom line reason why this is, they are much more involved and intense about their faith and its role in their lives.
It's the reason why we were put on this earth in the first place, and through that faith we hopefully inherit eternal life. That's why it's so important.
It's a means to salvation, life after death, after our human death. And, as you know, nothing greater comes from something lesser. So us being lesser to be joined with the greater God is just speechless.
Catholic faith is important to me because it gives meaning to my life and it makes suffering bearable and understandable, and it puts it into perspective.
They not only attend Mass more frequently, but they are much more engaged in other ways as well. We saw this with our own eyes. All over our Australian Charity with Clarity speaking tour, we spoke before hundreds and hundreds of Latin Rite Catholics in Melbourne, Wagga Wagga, Adelaide, Canberra, and Sydney, all over the place. But as the venues we were invited to speak of in front of the Maronite Catholics, this church right here, for example, the crowd numbered over 1,000, even though they are a relatively small percentage of the overall Catholic population. One church, this church right here in Sydney, it was packed and there was standing room only. And this happens with almost every Catholic speaker who shows up. Maronite Catholics have simply remained more devoted to their faith despite living in the same culture, working the same jobs, and living in the same cities. The one overriding difference is this: while the liturgy in the West has become abuse-ridden and in some cases almost unrecognizable as a Catholic sacrifice of the Mass, these abuses have resulted in a mass falling away of the faith because they have resulted in a loss of Catholic identity. This is not happening in the Maronite Church. The liturgy is largely unaffected by the wave of abuses that have swept over the Latin Rite Church. It's not perfect, but it's a much better case than most Latin Rite parishes. If leaders in the Latin Rite are looking for a way to stem the suicidal loss of faith that has crippled the Church for decades in the West, perhaps they could learn a lesson from the Maronites. A very important lesson. Reporting from Sydney in New South Wales, Australia, I'm Michael Voris. God love you.